Jerome Calloway was 64 years old and carrying a worn leather bag when they asked him to step off the plane. He had been in seat 3A for 11 minutes. He had boarded early the way he always did, not because of the priority boarding access he had held for 20 years, but because he liked the quiet of a plane before it filled, the way the cabin settled before it became complicated. He had put his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and opened his book. The man in 3B had looked at him once, made a calculation, and called the flight attendant over. What followed was brief, professional, and completely clear in its direction, a gentle request that Jerome wait in the jetway while a seating discrepancy was resolved. He picked up his bag. He walked to the door. He opened his book in the jetway and waited. What happened in the next 90 seconds cost the man in 3B nothing that day. What it cost him 3 days later was a different matter entirely. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The airport at 6:15 in the morning had a specific quality of light, flat and blue-white, the kind that makes everything look like evidence. Jerome Calloway had been moving through airports since he was 23 years old, and he still noticed the light every time. He was not a man who announced himself. He drove himself to airports. He carried his own bags. He wore plain dark clothes and shoes that were clean but not new, and the leather bag had been with him for 19 years and had the specific patina of something that had been well used and well maintained and showed both things clearly. He did not wear a watch that cost more than a semester of tuition. He did not need to. He had spent a long time understanding the difference between what a thing cost and what it was worth, and he had organized his life accordingly. He had grown up in Mobile, Alabama, the son of a man who repaired aircraft instruments for a regional maintenance company for 31 years, and a mother who taught middle school mathematics and kept every receipt she had ever been given in an expanding folder organized by month and year. They were people for whom precision was not a personality trait, but a survival skill. He had absorbed it the way you absorb things from people who have to mean what they demonstrate. He had joined the Air Force at 22. He had flown C-130s for 8 years. He had separated at 30 with a pilot's license, a logbook, a letter of commendation from his commanding officer, and an idea he had been building in composition notebooks for the previous 4 years. The idea was a regional airline, small, efficient, focused on underserved mid-Atlantic routes that major carriers found unprofitable and simply abandoned. The kind of idea that sounds obvious until you attempt to execute it and discover what obvious costs. He had spent the next 11 years building it. The company was called Calloway Air. It had been his in every way a thing can be a person's, built with his own money, his own hours, his own decisions, at a pace that left no room for mistakes and no margin for people who were not certain about what they were doing. What he had not anticipated, 36 years later, was Keith Sutton. Darian Mack had been in 3B when Jerome settled into 3A, and his first assessment of the man beside him had lasted approximately 4 seconds. The plain clothes, the worn bag, the paperback, the manner of a man who had absolutely no interest in being noticed by anyone. Darian was 36, a senior associate at a New York hedge fund, and he wore his money the way some men wear cologne, decisively and at a distance that ensured everyone nearby was aware of it. He had a black card, a platinum premier tier status, and a rolling carry-on he had hoped to store in the overhead bin directly above 3A, except it was already occupied. He looked at the man beside him. He made a second calculation. He flagged the flight attendant, a young woman named Ashley who had been flying for 8 months and was still learning the difference between a passenger complaint and a passenger command, and said, in the measured tone of a man who had made many things happen by saying them with sufficient confidence, "I think there may be a seating issue here." He said it the way someone cites a policy they have memorized for exactly this kind of moment. Ashley asked Jerome to verify his boarding pass. Jerome showed it without comment. She looked at it, looked at the seat number, looked back at Jerome with the careful, apologetic expression of someone doing their job correctly in a situation that had not been their creation. The senior flight attendant came. Then the gate supervisor. The conversation was quiet and professional and completely clear in its direction. Darian offered language about loyalty tier privileges that was technically accurate and entirely beside the point, and delivered with the patience of someone who intended to prevail. The gate supervisor, a woman of about 40 who was doing exactly what she had been trained to do, looked at Jerome and said, with genuine apology in her voice, "Sir, if you could just wait in the jetway for a few minutes while we sort this out." Jerome said, "All right." He picked up his bag. He walked to the door. He opened his book. He did not explain who he was. He did not say the words that would have ended the conversation in its first 30 seconds. He had learned over a long time that the moments when you most want to explain yourself are precisely the moments when you should decide whether the explanation is for you or for them. It was not for them. Not yet. He stood in the jetway and read. He heard footsteps from the direction of the cockpit. Captain Marcus Price was 58 years old, had been flying 767s for 22 years, and had started his career as a first officer at Callaway Air in 1991, the year the airline's Eastern Corridor expansion opened 12 new co-pilot positions. His advancement file had gone through Jerome's desk. Jerome had read it, initialed it, and written 2 sentences in the margin in his small, precise hand. "This one has the instincts. Keep him." Marcus had been kept. He had spent his career being kept, not by anyone's charity, but by his own competence, and by the foundation that a man who could read a file had given him when he was 27 years old and needed someone to see past his age. A crew member had mentioned to Marcus, in 4 words, what had happened in 3A. Marcus had set down his pre-flight checklist. He had come out of the cockpit and walked the full length of the first-class cabin, past 14 passengers, past the beverage cart, past Ashley with her apologetic expression, past the man in 3B who was rearranging his carry-on with the satisfaction of a transaction completed. He walked to the jetway door. He stopped in front of Jerome. He bowed. Not quickly, deliberately, a full, unhurried inclination of his head and upper body, the kind of gesture that could not be misread as courtesy or protocol or anything other than exactly what it was. He held it for a moment. Then, he straightened and looked at Jerome the way a person looks at someone they have been trying to repay for 30 years. And no, they never will. "Mr. Callaway," his voice carried back into the cabin. He did not lower it. He did not perform it either. It was simply what he said at the volume his voice naturally carried. "Your seat has been ready since we opened the door. It would be an honor to have you in it." Jerome looked at him for a moment. Something settled in his chest, not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter and older than that. "Marcus," he said, "how are your kids?" "Good, sir. The youngest just started flight school." "Tell him to call me when he's ready," Jerome said. He walked back down the aisle. He put his bag in the overhead. He sat in 3A. He opened his book. He did not look at 3B. The cabin was very quiet in a way that was different from its earlier quiet. 36 years before that flight, Jerome Callaway had registered Callaway Air in the state of Maryland with a filing fee of $65 and a checking account balance of $11,000 and change. Everything saved across 3 years of post-military contract work, and the proceeds from selling a truck he no longer needed. The first office was a rented room above a hardware store in Annapolis. The first aircraft was a leased 19-seat turboprop that he flew himself on the inaugural Baltimore to Roanoke route on a Tuesday morning in April. He had fueled it at 5:30 in the morning with a card that had enough left on it to cover the fuel and not much else. He had gotten in. He had done the pre-flight. He had flown. He did everything in the sequence it needed to be done, and at the pace that made it last. Route economics studied for 2 years before the first flight. Aircraft known because he had flown them. Operations understood because he had run them under conditions that left no margin. He had built Callaway Air the way he approached every complex problem, not by looking at any one piece, but by understanding the full structure from the inside out, knowing where the load was actually being carried, building in that sequence and no other. He had brought people up with him. That was the part analysts of his business consistently underweighted. The numbers worked because the people worked. And the people worked because Jerome had a quality his original bookkeeper, Margaret Whitfield, once described to his wife Evelyn as the ability to see what someone was going to be before they could see it themselves. Evelyn had said, dryly, that it was a generous way of describing the fact that he could not leave talented people alone. Margaret had kept that exchange the way she kept everything, precisely, and with affection for its specific truth. By 1999, Callaway Air ran 47 routes and a fleet of 22 aircraft. The merger with National Continental Airlines was the right move at the right time, and he had known it. He had negotiated the founding shareholder agreement carefully. The clauses protecting his equity stake and the veto rights that went with it, preserved as a condition of the deal. He had signed the papers on a Thursday morning, sat for a moment looking at his name on the last page, and driven home and cooked dinner. He did not need the event to be larger than it was. He understood what it was. That was sufficient. What he had not predicted was that someone would read the summary of the agreement instead of the document itself, and mistake the summary for the whole thing. His attorney, Catherine Osai, met him at the Charlotte gate with a flat expression and a coffee she had been holding for 12 minutes. She was 53, methodical in the way of people who had been reading contracts for 30 years without losing patience for what the words actually said. She had called Jerome the previous week and said she needed him in person before the governance review. "How was the flight?" she said. He told her. She listened without expression. She said, "Keep that in mind for context." She handed him the coffee. They sat in a conference room at the Charlotte office. She opened her bag and set documents on the table in the order she always set documents, by date, by type, by what they established. The National Continental Airlines Governance Review was in 3 days. The board was scheduled to vote on a proposed share issuance attached to a new financing instrument, a measure that had been moving through committee for 4 months with limited attention from outside the company. Catherine had been paying attention. She placed the first document on the table, share issuance records for the past 8 months, filed with the SEC, each one tied to a shell company called Meridian Holdings 7. The issuances were individually small. Together they had added 4. 3 million shares to the equity pool across 2 quarters. She placed a second document beside it, a beneficial ownership trace for Meridian Holdings 7. The controlling interest was held by a Delaware trust established 11 months ago. The trust's officer of record was a man named Daniel Sutton, Keith Sutton's brother. Jerome looked at the trace. He did not say anything. He picked up his coffee. The issuances aren't fraudulent on their face, Catherine said. The company has charter authorization for incremental issuances. What they are is precisely calibrated. She placed the third document on the table, Jerome's founding stake percentage, tracked quarterly from the merger date. A line on a chart, descending in small steps across 8 months. Before the issuances, you held 8.4% of original equity. After last month's issuance completed, she paused. You hold 7.9. 7.9, not 8. The veto protection in his founding shareholder agreement applied to any holder of 8% or more of original equity, calculated at the merger date and preserved against subsequent issuances. He looked at everything on the table and read it the way he read blueprints on a complex job. Not any one line, but the whole structure, feeling where the load was actually going, the shell company. The brother. 8 months of calibrated issuances arriving at a number that was not coincidental. Someone who had read the agreement closely enough to know exactly what threshold they needed to reach, and had reached it to the nearest 1/10 of a percentage point. Who reviewed the founding agreement when Keith took the CEO position? He said. His general counsel would have provided a summary brief, Catherine said. Standard practice. He set the document down. He thought about that. A summary brief, not the document itself. The summary would have captured Section 14B, the veto threshold. It would not necessarily have captured Section 14B. There's one more thing, Catherine said. She reached to the bottom of the stack. It was a note from Margaret Whitfield, 71 years old, retired in Annapolis. Handwritten, 2 pages, with a printed spreadsheet attached. Margaret had been tracking the share issuances from her living room for 8 months. On a spreadsheet she updated every week, the way she had kept every spreadsheet since 1988. Dated, annotated, sourced. She had flagged the pattern to Catherine 2 months ago in a phone call she described as just checking whether you were already watching this. She had been watching it herself since the second issuance, when the pattern became visible to anyone who was looking at the whole sequence rather than each entry in isolation. Jerome looked at the note for a moment. He recognized the handwriting. He had been recognizing it for 36 years. He looked at everything on the table. The issuances, the trace, the percentage, the agreement, the note. He could see the complete shape of it. He could see exactly where Keith had been careful and exactly where he had not been careful enough. He read the summary, Jerome said. He needed to read the document. Catherine looked at him. Section 14B, he said. He didn't move fast. Section 14B of the founding shareholder agreement was 14 lines long. It had been written in 1999 at Jerome's attorney's insistence, over the objection of the merger's lead counsel, who had called it unnecessarily complex. Jerome's attorney, a woman named Vera, who had died in 2011 and whose records were sealed, had said, "The clause is only complex if you intend to misuse the issuance mechanism." They had kept it. The clause addressed coordinated issuances, defined as any issuance of new equity to a related party within a 24-month window that in aggregate reduced a founding shareholder's percentage by more than 1 point of original equity. Jerome had entered the merger at 9.1%. He was now at 7.9. The reduction was 1.2. The issuances had gone to a trust controlled by the CEO's brother. The 24-month window was intact. The clause did not require the veto threshold. It required only documented evidence of the coordinated structure and formal invocation by the affected founding shareholder. The remedy was a mandatory independent review of the issuance mechanism before any vote on founding equity could proceed. He understood the sequencing completely. Invoke 14B die before the governance review opened. File the invocation with the board secretary with the supporting documentation attached. The mandatory review would stay the proposed issuance vote until the coordinated structure was independently examined. That was the sequence. That was all. He did not contact Keith. He did not notify anyone at the company. He did not act differently than he would have acted on any other week. He answered his calls. He did his work. He thought once about the jetway, about standing with his book in the morning airport light, waiting while someone sorted out whether he belonged in the seat he had paid for. He thought about Marcus walking down that aisle. He thought about the specific public quality of a bow from a man who did not have to give one. He thought about what it cost to be the kind of person who does not explain himself until the room is ready for the full explanation. He called Catherine on the evening of the second day. 5 a.m., he said. Have the invocation filed with the board secretary before anyone else is in the building. She said, it'll be ready at 4. Jerome arrived at the National Continental Airlines headquarters 20 minutes early. He liked it that way. The boardroom was on the 14th floor, long windows looking east, the morning city laid out below it, a table that seated 18 and currently held 14. He had not been in this room in 8 years. It had the feel of a room built to communicate permanence. He sat down, put his folder on the table, and waited. Catherine arrived at 8:40. She set her bag down without ceremony. Her associate Priya arrived 2 minutes later. They arranged the materials at Jerome's end of the table. Jerome sat with his hands flat on the surface and said nothing. He had brought the founding agreement and one folder. The board filed in at 9. Keith Sutton came in last, the practiced entrance of a man who understood that timing is its own communication. He scanned the room. He saw Jerome. There was a half-second of something, adjustment, recalibration, before warmth replaced it. Jerome, he said. Correct warmth. I didn't see you on the agenda. I'm not on the agenda, Jerome said. I'm invoking a founders right under the shareholder agreement. The invocation was filed with the board secretary at 4:57 this morning. He paused. It's in the document. The board chair, Patricia Hines, looked at Catherine. Catherine opened the folder. The first document was the formal invocation of Section 14BI, time-stamped and entered into the record. The second was the share issuance registry, 8 months for 3 million shares, Meridian Holdings 7. The third was the beneficial ownership trace. Daniel Sutton. The Delaware Trust. The date of establishment, 11 months prior. The fourth was the founding percentage timeline, a line descending across 8 months in small, regular steps to exactly 7.9. Catherine walked through it in the voice she reserved for information that did not require decoration, level, precise, at the pace that allowed everyone in the room to follow each step before the next one arrived. She read the definition of coordinated issuance from 14B. She read the remedy. She set the document in the center of the table. The room was quiet in the way of rooms where people are doing arithmetic very quickly and arriving at the same answer from different directions. Keith's general counsel leaned in and spoke low. Keith placed one hand flat on the table, a small, controlled gesture. He looked at Patricia. He said, "We should take a recess too. The invocation is already in the record," Patricia said. Not unkindly. The review is mandatory under the agreement. She looked at Catherine. We'll proceed accordingly. Keith looked at Jerome then. A direct look, for the first time since entering the room. Whatever he had believed walking through the door, that the percentage was right, that the summary had been sufficient, that the thing was done, was not visible on his face anymore. Jerome looked back at him for a moment. He said it quietly, not for the room, for Keith. You needed my percentage below 8. You got it to 7.9. A pause. The agreement has a subsection. You read the summary. He buttoned his jacket. You needed to read the document. He stood. He shook Catherine's hand, then Priya's. He walked toward the door without looking back at the table. It did not happen all at once. The independent review took 11 weeks. Its report, 43 pages, not made public in full, classified the Meridian Holdings 7 issuances as a coordinated dilution under Section 14B DDI. The shares were rescinded. Jerome's founding percentage returned to 9.1. His veto rights were confirmed and remained in force. Keith Sutton resigned as CEO in the 3rd month following the review, citing personal reasons. The board accepted the resignation and issued a 2-paragraph statement. He was gone by the end of the month. A governance framework for related party issuances was adopted the following quarter. Jerome reviewed the draft, submitted 4 written comments through Catherine, and did not attend the adoption meeting. He had done what he came to do. He was not interested in running the company. He had never been interested in running any company that was not his to build. He called Margaret Whitfield when the review concluded. He told her what had been decided. She said, "Good." Then she asked if he had been eating properly. He said he had. She did not fully believe him, but she let it go, which was the long-practiced rhythm of their friendship. He sent her a card the following week. Handwritten, 3 things that her records had mattered, that he had always known they would, and that Evelyn would have had something extremely precise to say about all of it, something that was funny and true in equal measure, and that he had been trying for 2 months to capture it and could not, which Evelyn would also have found extremely funny. Margaret kept the card in the expanding folder she organized by month and year. She had been keeping it that way since 1988. She did not see any reason to change the system. On a Tuesday morning in April, 36 years to the month from the first Callaway Air departure, Jerome Callaway stood at a window in the Charlotte airport and watched the morning's first wave of departures line up on the taxiway. He had a flight in an hour. He had come early, the way he always did, for the quiet and the light. He stood at the gate window with his coffee and his leather bag and watched the planes move. A 737 turning onto the active runway, its engines stepping up with the specific tone of something about to commit fully to a direction. A regional jet holding short, patient, waiting for its sequence. A cargo carrier climbing out over the western edge of the city, gaining altitude, not quickly, but steadily, the way everything that is built to last gains it, without rushing, without announcement, in the sequence the physics required. He watched until the cargo carrier was a point of light above the morning cloud. Then he picked up his bag. He checked his boarding pass. He walked toward the gate. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.